Hello everyone. If you love heartwarming animal stories and want to follow the inspiring journey of these adorable friends, don't forget to hit the subscribe button now so you won't miss any of our videos. Now, let's dive into today's emotional story. The small town of Fairview was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where families gathered for weekend barbecues, and where children played outside until the streetlights flickered on. It was peaceful, safe, a place where nothing truly terrible ever happened. At least, that's what people thought. For Mark Carter, a firefighter with over 15 years of experience, safety wasn't something to take for granted. He had seen too many tragedies, too many lives lost because of a single mistake: an unchecked wire, a forgotten candle, a smoke alarm with dead batteries. He dedicated his life to protecting others, but there was one person he would always protect above all else: his 8-year-old son, Jake. Jake was the heart of the Carter household. Energetic, bright-eyed, and endlessly curious, he had inherited his father's love for adventure and his mother's compassionate nature. His world was filled with comic books, fire truck toys, and one very special best friend, Lucky. Lucky wasn't just a pet. He was a retired search and rescue canine, a German shepherd who had once saved lives alongside Mark. When the time came for Lucky to retire, Mark couldn't bear the thought of parting with him. And so, Lucky became family. Despite his age, Lucky was still sharp. He knew every creak in the Carter house, every shift in the wind, every unusual scent in the air. And above all, he knew Jake. Every morning, Lucky walked Jake to the bus stop, waiting patiently until the yellow school bus disappeared down the road. Every afternoon, he sat by the window, ears perked, tail wagging, until Jake came running through the front door. At bedtime, Lucky would curl up on Jake's floor, listening to the soft sounds of the boy's breathing, his protective instincts never fading. Jake, in turn, adored Lucky. He told him everything: his dreams of becoming a firefighter like his dad, the silly jokes he heard at school, even the days when he felt lonely. Lucky was his shadow, his protector, his best friend. But some nights, Lucky wouldn't sleep. Some nights, he would pace near the front door, ears twitching, his instincts whispering that something was off. Jake would giggle and roll over in bed. "It's just the wind, Lucky," he'd mumble sleepily. "Go to sleep." Lucky never ignored his instincts. And soon, they would save a life once again. The evening was like any other. The Carter family sat around the dinner table, the warmth of their fireplace filling the house. Emily, Jake's mother, had made her famous homemade lasagna, and Jake was busy telling a dramatic story about a fire-breathing dragon he had drawn at school that day. Mark chuckled as he ruffled his son's hair. "Sounds like we have a future firefighter in the making." Jake grinned. "I'm gonna save people like you, Dad." Emily smiled, but her eyes were filled with worry. Mark worked long shifts, sometimes disappearing for days when wildfires raged outside town. She had learned to live with the fear, but it never got easier. After dinner, Jake yawned and stretched his arms. "I think I'll go to bed early," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Emily kissed his forehead. "Good night, sweetheart." Jake shuffled down the hall, Lucky following close behind. In his bedroom, Jake changed into his pajamas and crawled under his blankets. Lucky circled 3 times before settling at the foot of the bed, resting his head on his paws. Jake reached down, scratching behind his ears. "Good night, buddy." Lucky sighed, his eyes flickering closed. but something wasn't right. Long before the first spark ignited, Lucky's ears twitched. Long before the smoke filled the hallways, Lucky's nose twitched. Long before the flames came, Lucky was already awake. The house was silent. The cool autumn wind howled outside, making the windows tremble. But Lucky wasn't listening to the wind. He was listening to something else. A sound too small for human ears. A faint, almost imperceptible crackling coming from the living room. Lucky stood up suddenly, his body tense. His nostrils flared as he sniffed the air. Then, he smelled it. It was faint at first, hidden beneath the scent of burned-out candles and the smoky wood of the fireplace. But it was there. A scent he would never forget. Fire. And this time, it wasn't a training exercise. This time, it was real. Lucky bolted toward the door, his claws scraping against the hardwood floor. He had seconds, maybe less, before it was too late. And Jake was still fast asleep. The night was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the soft rustling of trees swaying outside the Carter home. The wind whispered through the branches, tapping against the windows like ghostly fingers. Jake slept peacefully, his small body curled under the thick blanket. His dreams were filled with images of fire trucks, flashing red lights, and heroic rescues, visions of himself one day becoming a firefighter, just like his father. But in the depths of the house, something sinister had already begun. A faulty electrical wire behind the living room wall had been slowly deteriorating for months, unnoticed, ignored. That night, as the cold wind outside made the house's heating system work harder, the old wire sparked. At first, it was just a tiny ember, hidden inside the wall. But then another spark. And another. Within minutes, the heat ignited the insulation, and the fire came to life. The flames spread quietly, creeping like a predator through the walls, unseen, unfelt. The fire alarm remained silent, its batteries, long dead, had never been replaced. Thick, black smoke coiled through the house, slipping under doors, curling through hallways. It moved like a shadow, swallowing everything in its path. And inside his room, Jake didn't stir. But Lucky did. Lucky's ears twitched. His nose flared. Something was wrong. At first, the scent was faint, a whisper of something unnatural in the air. His instincts screamed at him before his mind even understood why. He lifted his head from the floor, ears flicking in different directions. Then he smelled it. Smoke. It was still distant, but he knew fire was coming. Lucky's body snapped into action. He leapt to his feet, tail stiff, eyes sharp. He took a deep breath, thicker smoke. Stronger. The fire was growing. And Jake was still asleep. Lucky lunged toward the door, pawing at it frantically, whining loudly. But Jake didn't wake up. The smoke had already begun to seep under the door, poisoning the air. Lucky let out a deep, urgent bark. Still, Jake didn't move. Lucky jumped onto the bed, his weight jostling the mattress. He nudged Jake's face with his cold, wet nose, then barked again, louder, more desperate. This time, Jake stirred. His brows furrowed. His nose wrinkled as he inhaled the smoke. His body tensed. Then his eyes snapped open. The room was darker than before, clouded with a thin haze. His throat burned, his chest felt heavy, and a strange panic began to rise inside him. Lucky," he croaked, voice hoarse. Lucky barked again, urgently, then moved to the edge of the bed, grabbing Jake's pajama sleeve in his powerful jaws. Jake coughed, his head feeling dizzy. What's going on? Then he saw it. Smoke curling under the door. And suddenly he understood. A wave of terror crashed over Jake. His small hands clutched at Lucky's fur. "Dad!" He tried to scream, but his voice came out weak. He tried to get up, but his limbs felt heavy. The smoke was already making his head spin, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. Lucky tugged at him, forcing him toward the edge of the bed. Jake stumbled as his bare feet touched the cold wooden floor. His knees wobbled, but Lucky pressed against his legs, steadying him. The dog's instincts knew they had to get out now. Lucky darted toward the door, but stopped short. The air beyond it was thicker, blacker. The fire was closer than he thought. Jake coughed violently, gripping Lucky's collar for support. Tears stung his eyes. He couldn't see. Lucky pivoted sharply. He sniffed the air, searching for a safer route. The window. Lucky jumped onto Jake's bed and scratched at the glass. His nails clicked against it desperately. Jake blinked through the haze. His mind, sluggish from the smoke, barely processed what Lucky was doing. "The window," he rasped. Lucky barked. Jake staggered forward, gripping the window latch. His fingers fumbled. It wouldn't budge. "Help, Lucky," he whispered weakly. Lucky jumped down, his teeth grabbing the bottom edge of Jake's pajama shirt. He pulled with all his strength, yanking Jake back to the bed just as the door burst open. A wall of fire surged forward. The heat slammed into the room, swallowing everything in an orange-red inferno. Lucky shoved Jake toward the window, barking furiously. Jake fought to breathe as he reached for the latch again, finally pushing it open. Cool air rushed in. Lucky jumped first, landing on the damp grass outside. He turned back immediately, barking frantically, his eyes locked onto Jake. Jake hesitated. He looked back one last time. His room, his toys, his drawings on the walls, everything was disappearing in flames. Lucky barked again. And Jake jumped. He fell into the cold night air, crashing onto the grass with a soft thud. Lucky was on him in an instant, nudging him, making sure he was okay. Jake sucked in fresh air, coughing hard, but alive. That's when he heard his mother's scream. "Jake!" Through the swirling smoke, he saw his parents running toward him, panic in their faces. Mark scooped Jake into his arms, holding him tight. Emily was sobbing, kissing his soot-covered cheeks over and over. Mark looked down at Lucky, his heart pounding. "You saved him," he whispered. Lucky panted, tail wagging slightly despite his exhaustion. Then sirens. The distant wail of fire trucks racing toward their burning home. Jake buried his face in his father's chest, clutching Lucky's fur with trembling fingers. The fire had taken so much. But thanks to Lucky, it hadn't taken him. The night sky over Fairview was painted in an eerie glow of flickering orange and red. The once quiet street was now alive with blaring sirens, flashing emergency lights, and shouting firefighters. Jake clung to his father, his small body trembling, while Lucky sat beside him, his breathing ragged but his eyes still sharp. Mark held Jake tightly, pressing a hand against his son's soot-covered hair. "You're okay," he murmured, his voice cracking. "You're safe." But when he looked over Jake's shoulder, his heart clenched. The house, their home, was engulfed in flames. The fire had spread too fast, devouring everything in its path. The walls crackled as the heat intensified, windows shattered from the pressure, sending shards of glass raining onto the lawn. Emily sobbed into Mark's shoulder, her eyes glued to the inferno. "Oh my God," she choked out. "Mark, what if Jake hadn't?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Mark swallowed hard, unable to think about the alternative. Lucky had saved their son's life. But the fire wasn't over yet. 2 fire trucks screeched to a stop, and within seconds, firefighters poured out like a well-trained army. Mark knew every single one of them. They were his brothers and sisters, the people he had run into burning buildings with for over a decade. But tonight, he was one of the victims. Captain Rogers, the fire chief, locked eyes with him. "Mark, what's the situation?" Mark took a deep breath, forcing himself to think like a firefighter, not a terrified father. "It started inside faulty wiring, I think." The flames spread through the walls. "No gas leaks, but the structure's unstable. It's too late to save the house." Captain Rogers nodded grimly, then turned to his team. "All units, defensive attack. Focus on containment." Hoses roared to life, sending powerful jets of water toward the inferno. Firefighters moved like clockwork, battling the blaze with precision. But Mark knew the house was lost. His chest ached. He had saved so many families from this exact nightmare, yet now, his own family stood in the street, watching their home burn. Jake buried his face in Lucky's fur, tears slipping down his sooty cheeks. "Is everything gone?" he whispered. Emily stroked his back, her voice shaky. "We still have each other. That's what matters." But Jake couldn't stop thinking about the things inside his drawings, his favorite books, the old firefighter helmet his dad had given him. Everything was turning to ash. And then a horrible realization hit him. Jake suddenly gasped, his eyes going wide with panic. "The photo album," he cried, pulling away from his father's arms. "Mom's photo album is still inside." Emily's breath hitched. Her entire childhood, her parents' wedding photos, every picture of Jake from the day he was born, they were all in that album. It was irreplaceable. Mark immediately shook his head. "Jake, no. We can't go back in there." "But Dad." "No." Mark's voice was firm, his hands gripping Jake's shoulders. "Listen to me. The house is too dangerous now." Jake looked devastated, his small hands shaking. Lucky, still watching the flames, let out a low whimper. Then, before anyone could react, Lucky took off toward the fire. "Lucky!" Jake screamed. Mark and Emily's heads snapped toward the house, their hearts lurching in terror. Lucky darted through the yard, weaving through fallen debris. His nose twitched, ears pinned back, eyes locked onto a single goal. He wasn't just running toward the flames. He was running toward the house. Mark lunged forward, but Captain Rogers grabbed his arm. "Mark, don't. He'll die in there." Mark roared, his voice raw with fear. But before he could break free, something unbelievable happened. Through the broken front door, Lucky disappeared into the smoke. Seconds stretched into eternity. Jake screamed for him, his voice desperate, pleading. "Lucky! Please come back." Tears spilled down Emily's face. "Mark, he's not coming back." Mark's heart shattered. His partner, his best friend, the dog who had saved so many lives, had just run into certain death. The firefighters held him back, and all they could do was watch. For nearly a full minute, there was nothing. Just roaring flames. Just falling debris. Just silence. Jake sobbed into Emily's chest, his entire body shaking. Mark squeezed his eyes shut. He couldn't believe this was happening. Then, a sound. Faint, but unmistakable. A bark. Mark's eyes snapped open. Another bark, louder this time. Then movement. Through the thick, black smoke a shadow emerged. It was Lucky. And clenched in his teeth, covered in soot but still intact, was Emily's photo album. A collective gasp filled the street. Mark and Jake raced forward as Lucky stumbled toward them, his legs shaky, his fur singed. Jake fell to his knees, throwing his arms around Lucky's neck. "Lucky," he sobbed. "You came back. You came back." Lucky whined softly, nuzzling into Jake's embrace. Mark dropped to his knees beside them, his throat too tight to speak. He ran his hands over Lucky's fur, checking for injuries, his fingers shaking. The dog was exhausted, but miraculously alive. Emily held the soot-covered photo album against her chest, tears running down her cheeks. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He really did it." Lucky looked up at them, his tail wagging weakly, his eyes full of quiet triumph. He had done what he was trained to do. He had saved one more thing that mattered. The fire in the Carter home raged for hours before the firefighters finally gained control. By then, most of the house had been reduced to ash and rubble. The once cozy home, filled with warmth and laughter, now stood in ruin. The firefighters had done their best, but the house was beyond saving. But no one was thinking about the house. All eyes were on Lucky, the dog who had defied death to save something irreplaceable. Lucky lay on the grass, his body exhausted, his fur singed, but his tail wagging weakly as Jake and his parents hovered over him. The photo album, now covered in soot and smelling of smoke, sat in Emily's trembling hands. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched it to her chest. I can't believe he actually saved it," she whispered. Mark's throat was tight with emotion. He stroked Lucky's head, his fingers brushing against the patches of fur that had been scorched by the flames. "He's a fighter," he murmured. "Just like always." But Jake wasn't saying anything. He was hugging Lucky tightly, his small arms wrapped around the dog's neck. His body trembled from the shock, the fear, and the overwhelming relief of having his best friend back. "You scared me," Jake whispered into Lucky's fur. "Don't ever do that again." Lucky let out a small, tired whimper, nudging Jake's cheek with his nose. It was his way of saying, "I had to." Because that's what heroes do. Word of Lucky's bravery spread through Fairview like wildfire. The very next day, neighbors, friends, and even strangers came to see the Carter family. People from all over town gathered outside the burned remains of their home, offering clothes, food, and a place to stay. Emily, overwhelmed by the support, wiped her eyes. "We don't know how to thank you all." Mrs. Thompson, their elderly neighbor, gave Emily a gentle smile. "You raised a wonderful family," she said, "and you've got the best dog in the world." Jake beamed proudly, looking down at Lucky, who lay beside him on a blanket, resting but still alert. Then came the biggest surprise of all. 2 days later, as Jake sat beside Lucky at the temporary shelter the firefighters had arranged, a news van pulled up outside. A woman with a microphone stepped out, followed by a cameraman. "We heard about your incredible dog," the reporter said, kneeling in front of Jake. "Would you like to tell the world about Lucky?" Jake's eyes widened. "The whole world?" The reporter smiled. "Everyone should hear about the bravest dog in Fairview." Jake looked down at Lucky, whose tail wagged lazily. He grinned. "Yeah," he said. "I'd love to." A week after the fire, the Fairview Fire Department held a special ceremony. Dozens of people gathered in the town square, where a stage had been set up. Firefighters in full uniform stood proudly, their helmets shining under the afternoon sun. Mark, wearing his own uniform, stood beside Jake and Emily as Captain Rogers stepped forward with a microphone. "Today," he announced, "we recognize a hero. Not a firefighter, not a police officer, but a dog." The crowd cheered, their applause echoing through the streets. "Lucky is a reminder," Captain Rogers continued, "that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. And sometimes, they have 4 legs and a wagging tail." Jake beamed with pride, his hands gripping Lucky's fur. Captain Rogers gestured to Mark. "As a firefighter, Mark Carter has saved countless lives. But this time, it was his own family that needed saving. And it wasn't him who ran into the fire, it was Lucky." Mark's voice broke as he took the microphone. He knelt beside Lucky, placing a gentle hand on his head. "Buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you more than I can ever repay." The fire chief stepped forward, holding something in his hands. It was a medal. A real firefighter's medal. The moment Jake saw it, his eyes lit up. The chief knelt beside Lucky, gently fastening the medal around his neck. "From this day forward," he announced, "Lucky is an honorary firefighter of Fairview." The crowd erupted into cheers. Jake laughed through his tears, wrapping his arms around Lucky's neck. "You're a real hero now," he whispered. "Like Dad." Lucky wagged his tail, licking Jake's face. He didn't need a medal to know he had done something important. But as he lay beside his best friend, feeling the warmth of love, pride, and endless belly rubs, he figured, it was a nice bonus. 2 months later, with the town's help, the Carter family moved into a new house, one built with stronger walls, a modern security system, and, most importantly, a fire alarm that never ran out of batteries. Jake's new room was even better than the old one. His walls were decorated with pictures of fire trucks, his dad, and, of course, Lucky. A special shelf held his most prized possession, Lucky's firefighter medal, framed in glass. That night, as Jake climbed into bed, Lucky jumped up beside him instead of curling up on the floor. Jake grinned. "Fine, you can sleep here tonight," he said, scratching Lucky's ears. "But don't snore." Lucky let out a happy sigh, resting his head on Jake's chest. The house was new, but nothing had changed. Because as long as they had each other, they were home. The story of Lucky and Jake teaches us a powerful lesson about loyalty, bravery, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. In times of crisis, true heroes are not always those in uniform. Sometimes they have 4 legs and a wagging tail. Lucky's instinct, determination, and love for Jake prove that animals are capable of extraordinary acts of courage, often sensing danger before humans can. This story reflects real-life situations where dogs have saved lives, whether by alerting families to fires, detecting medical emergencies, or providing emotional support in difficult times. Many rescue dogs and service animals help people with disabilities, PTSD, and even early detection of diseases. Their presence in our lives is not just about companionship but a deep, instinctive connection that goes beyond words. Lucky's story also reminds us about the importance of fire safety. Many tragedies occur due to overlooked precautions, like dead smoke alarm batteries or faulty wiring. This tale encourages us to take preventive measures while appreciating the silent protectors in our lives, whether they are first responders, family members, or the faithful pets who stand by us, ready to risk everything when it matters most.